I'm making a roguelike, and items are very important in roguelikes. Unfortunately, the more items I add, the more a certain issue rears its ugly head. I'm Levin, and I'm developing a roguelike platformer thing called MythoMania. In it, you pissed off every single god from every mythology, and you have to fight them all off by stacking items and spamming left click. So in this devlog, I'm mostly making more items and continuing on the downward spiral that adding more items has started me on. So let's get into development. Everybody knows the most exciting part of game development is the UI. UI, or user interesting buttons and images, is when you put things on screen and the user uses it. So I already have UI, and quite a bit of it actually, but the fun thing about UI is that it actually has to look nice as well. So the item pop-up I have right now, it's not good enough. It's boring looking, and plus it has way too much text. This is a very legitimate issue, as it can be really tough for a starting player to pick up a new item and then be greeted with a text wall of stuff they have to understand. But I also want to make it so the players have access to full descriptions as well to tell you everything about the item. So I made a simplified description for each item that only tells you the absolutely necessary values. I also started color coding parts of the text, but honestly that takes forever. So I'm gonna wait on that and see if I can make a custom tag system or something to speed up the process in the future. The item pop-up itself is pretty simple. I made a scrolling background for it. An outline that's based on the rarity of the item, some animations for the text, including a unique animation for godly tier items, and a Greek ruin theme outline. I think most of the UI in the game will follow a similar style, being black and white with mythology themed details. And I can also confidently say that I now have a better UI than the Super Bowl. That's going straight onto the resume, right below my bot animator that generates 47 dropshipping websites per second. By the way, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do it is just by wishlisting MythoMania on Steam. It's free and it helps me out in the Steam algorithm whenever I release. So I've been finishing up the second area of the game, the Nordic area, and I need two more things right now, a water enemy and a final boss. But a final boss sounds like a lot of work. So water enemy it is. I figured it would be a pretty simple enemy, just a stationary enemy that spawns in water and shoots seeking projectiles. I was originally going to make a tiny waft from New Zealand folklore, but then I saw this comment and decided to switch it to Shiofuki just to spite them.
Just kidding.
I just kind of realized that the Tanyawa didn't fit the design of a stationary projectile enemy, so I'll probably make it in the future and make it a watered enemy that has snake movement. But for now I picked out a replacement creature, the Shiofuki. Now if you look up Shiofuki, be sure to have safe search on, as it has a interesting slang meaning in Japanese, but it's a Japanese yokai that spits water at people. I swear, there's a yokai for everything. But this also perfectly fits the theme of a projectile shooting water monster. So I set up a unique spawning animation for water monsters, add a simple swimming animation, sound effects, a seeking bubble projectile, and yeah, it's done. Okay, so most of you probably clicked on the video because you love me so much, but the rest of you are probably interested in why adding more items to my game somehow makes the game worse. Now, obviously in some ways, new items do improve the game, as they add more variety and allow for more builds and there's fun. But in other ways, they also make the game worse, as they add more variety. Let me explain. My game is designed so there will be certain items to fulfill certain basic requirements for your character, like movement speed, HP, stuff like that. Certain items also synergize well with other items, and some are even required for the other item to have effects. For example, most of the crit items require you to have some crit in order for them to be useful. Adding more items to the pool means that this item pool will get more and more diluted. And so it'll become harder and harder to get good builds and get the items you need. This makes the game worse and also makes it hard for me to balance the game at this point in time because I'm not looking at a full item pool simply because I don't have all the items done. So how do I fix this? Well, there's one easy way, and that's giving the player more items. Of course, that also makes the game easier and makes item choices less meaningful, so I'm going to avoid that for now. I just decided to instead make a spreadsheet. This is sick. Genuinely the coolest thing ever. If you don't think this big spreadsheet is cool, then unsubscribe now. So yeah, now I can look at all my items in one view with lots of stats and things, but the big deal is the categories. So these categories should help me to make items that fulfill specific categories that you need in your build. For example, right now there's only one movement speed item in the game, so it's getting harder and harder to increase your movement speed. So I need to add a few more items to do a similar thing to the basic movement speed item, but they're also a little bit different, which will add more variety and bring those chances back to normal. That's a pretty simple solution, but there's also a bigger, longer term problem. I have no idea what my game will look like in a few months. Sure, I have a decent amount of items planned out, and plans for like enemies and stuff, but it's a slow and very iterative process. So I don't know exactly how each item will play with each other. Like so many other problems in game design, and especially balancing, there's no simple solution to this. So my plan is just to do a whole lot of planning right now. Adding whatever items I like is cool and fun, but I need to also focus on adding items that combo well with each other and allow for specific builds to be made. And in the future, I also need to be willing to rework and even get rid of old items that don't fit into the game anymore. Overall, it'll end up being a very iterative process. But luckily, I like making items, so it should be fun. I also want builds in the game to be a very mix and match thing, with builds not really being your entire character, but instead being different pieces that you slot together. For example, a build that focuses heavily on having high attack speed and triggering lots of proc chains, which if you haven't played Risk of Rain 2, a proc chain is whenever this happens. But a build like that will combo well with the explosion build, as the explosions can proc even more items, and then if those enemies are killed, they'll proc more explosions, and the cycle continues. And things like movement, protection, and money are useful to all builds, so you'll want to have different ways of getting each of those. But the goal is to ultimately make it so that even if at certain points of development the item pool is ridiculously unbalanced, by the end of development, I want it to be nice and balanced, without me having to do an insane amount of changes in iteration. So obviously it makes sense not to add too many items right now. Okay, let's add some more. I guess I just like making items too much. I'll deal with the consequences later. So I started off by cleaning up some of the old items I have that aren't quite finished or are a bit buggy. The big item is the Dragon King, who is a legendary familiar item from Chinese mythology, and I need to finish up some art for him, so I made each of his levels have different colors based on the 5 Dragon Kings in Chinese mythology. I don't think that any of these Dragon Kings are actually stronger than the others in the original mythos, so I just ordered them by whichever one looks the coolest, in my opinion. I also reworked how the Dragon King works a bit, but the basic idea behind him is still that he gets stronger for every familiar you have, but that he also buffs other familiars' damage. But for some reason, I also used to have it so that he had a chance to inflict random status effects of his attacks, which is a really unrelated thing. So I removed that, and I instead made him buff other familiars more, making it so that if you keep stacking him beyond his base levels, then he'll just continue to increase the damage for every single other familiar. I also fixed bugs with items like the Ritual Dagger, which does extra damage to enemies at 90% HP or higher, as the dagger had a lot of bugs. And I also finished adding an item which makes enemies drop healing apples on death. It's pretty strong and one of the only healing items in the game. I'm honestly not 100% sure how I want to handle healing in the game, as I want taking damage to punish a player by forcing you to spend some of your money on health flask instead of on chests. So my basic philosophy right now is that though you can have healing in the game, you should not be able to farm endless healing through things like dealing damage or crits or anything. It should only be things that you can do finite amounts. For example, killing enemies, as there's only a finite amount of enemies in each wave. I do need to also make sure that minion enemies don't spawn heals though. And after I was done with this, I also fixed some bugs with the health bar. One thing that I added that I'm also not sure about is a few items which have trade-offs. So I added one that increases your crit rate by 20% but decreases your attack speed, as well as one that increases the money gained but halves your max HP. The idea with the first one is that it's a way to speed up getting crits, in case you really want or need that in your build. But if you get enough Argus Eyes, which are the basic crit item which have no downside, then you can remove these trade-off ones to get rid of the downside. And for the money one, it's also a risk, but if you are confident that you won't die, you can take that risk and get some extra money, and then remove it whenever you want the cap on your health back. I like both these items. They're both commons and are also mixed in with the rest of the item pool, so they aren't like some special thing like lunar items are in Risk of Rain 2. I'm actually not really sure how a rare or legendary item with trade-offs would be, but I think that they could be an interesting way to make really unique runs by getting you a really big buff and a really big debuff. So I'm taking suggestions for trade-off items, and I would also like feedback on if anybody thinks I should even add them. And finally, I'm going to try making more defined synergies of builds in the game. So I figured that I'll add a couple of new items to a sort of build that I want to be more prominent in the game. Explosions. Explosions are fun, but right now there's only an explosion on death item, which is cool, but I want more. So I'm starting by adding 2 more items. First off is also an explosion on death item, but it works only for on fire enemies, and it's bigger and spreads the fire status effect. So it's kind of an in-between for the status effect build and the explosion build. Plus, stacking more of these items boost fire damage, so it's a really good combination, especially if you already have a maxed out fire chance. And secondly, I'm making a godly item, which makes explosions also spawn 5 smaller explosions afterwards. So now getting these items together gives you an insane amount of power against groups of enemies. Right now you can still only trigger explosions on killing enemies, so you do have to have another way to deal damage to get that initial kill, and it's not too useful against bosses. but it is really powerful. And I'm gonna eventually probably also add another smaller sort of explosion. Maybe one triggered whenever an enemy is hit with a projectile or something. I also worked on the second boss for the game, Thor, but he's still very jank, and frankly, I don't really feel like working on him right now. I've been in the mood to make items, enemies, and stages, so I don't really want to pause all the momentum I have to work on Thor. So I'm putting it off for now. Finally, I decided that I want to add a bit more depth to the combat. It's pretty good right now, but it would be way better if I added another move that the player can perform. Plus, it'll also make it easier for me to differentiate between the different characters I plan to eventually add. So that means that it's time to make Homer, our default guy, a little bit more interesting. I decided that his kit should be built around pogoing, and he gets a new special attack on a cooldown where he becomes invincible and slams down enemies, doing a bunch of damage. However, he also has a passive ability, which is a thing you can have now, where he stacks a status effect each time he bounces on the enemy. And whenever he slams down, it deals more damage for each stack of this effect. Using the slam or touching the ground resets the stacks of the effects to 0. So Homer has to stay up in the air and bounce repeatedly in order to build up a big burst of damage, which I think is a pretty cool playstyle. It also means that he benefits even more from items like the Valkyrie's Blessing, which gives him a double jump and allows him to stay in the air for longer and build up more stacks. And finally, I finished out for this devlog by adding a new bit of cooldown UI for the special attack and fixing some issues with a shop that was making all items free, which probably isn't ideal. But yeah, that's all for this devlog. Next devlog, I'll be finishing up Thor, maybe adding a second playable character, and most importantly, I'll finally be adding the last major mechanic for the game, making alliances with the gods. So be sure to subscribe for that. You can also play a demo from about a month ago on is.io if you follow the link in the description. And also be sure to wishlist the game on Steam. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.
Look at this, it's John Pork. No,
What?